Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for picking this over a beautiful spring evening. I know being inside at this time of year is difficult for all of us, but I think you will pat yourself on the back at the end of the evening for having taken some time to listen to Chris Calloway's. Chris and I have worked together remotely for years. I'm Scott Crichton, I'm the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union in Montana. And Chris is a Legislative Counsel for Privacy Issues in our Washington Legislative Office. Chris has several years of experience in the DC office, which, let me just give you a brief picture of ACLU and how it is staffed. Nationally, there is a Washington Legislative Office that has some 40 employees in it that do a variety of things in covering the national legislative front. And Chris can talk about that organizationally some. Then the main office for the American Civil Liberties Union is in New York City. And there are approximately 300 employees there, 100 of whom are lawyers. So there are opportunities for public interest law and defending civil liberties, not just in those two offices, but also in affiliate offices all over the country. So we in Montana are celebrating our 40th year as an affiliate of the national organization. The national, yes, we're pleased with that. And the national organization actually has been around for 92 years. So each state has an affiliate with a couple of exceptions. Wyoming and the Dakotas are so sparsely populated that they have national staff that operate their offices. But by and large, it's safe to say that every state has an affiliate. And that means that we're there to be able to respond to complaints from people who feel like their civil liberties have been denied them, and provide legal services as well as educational services and legislative services, because we've come to understand that sometimes it's a lot easier to stop bad law from being made than it is having to fight it once it's implemented. Although we'll do it either way, we have to, both in some instances. So that's just a little snapshot of the American Civil Liberties Union. I will remind you that we have an open house for our offices on 241 Alder that we're holding on First Friday from 5:30 to 7:30, and you're welcome to come, meet the rest of the staff, and visit about what's important to you. Obviously, civil liberties are important to us, and we take our responsibility very seriously. And in that regard, we thought it would be great to bring somebody who has real expertise in dealing with the issues of digital privacy. Chris has broader expertise than that, and you're welcome to ask him questions about cyber terrorism and other issues that are also in his portfolio. But he's prepared some remarks for you tonight in his left room for questions and answers afterwards. So won't you give a warm Montana welcome to Chris Calloway. Thanks.
I'm going to try to rock the Phil Donahue cordless mic here, because I can't quite lean over that far without looking slightly silly. So I'm going to talk like this, and if the mic gets too far away from my face, give me the hands up, and I'll talk back close to it. Thank you, Scott, for that nice introduction. I will say that working for the ACLU is a great gig. So if you ever get the opportunity to do it, I highly recommend it. That will be my pitch for the ACLU. I've titled this talk, Is the Privacy in the Digital Age, is the Fourth Amendment still relevant in our technological world? I will give away the punchline and tell you, yes, I think it is. So I know that will shock you that the ACLU lawyer thinks the Fourth Amendment is still relevant. But I hope to tell you why I think that's the case, how we've sort of gotten where we are in terms of the technologies that we have and the law that surrounds them. So, I think the big initial point to understand is that We live today in a world of records. Everything we do and everything we interact with leaves a trail of records. Our interests, our habits, our movements, our political beliefs, all of this is recorded by the places we go online, the places we visit physically when we're carrying our cell phones, for example, our social networking habits, our photos, the public information we share with the government. And there is just an enormous amount of information that is being generated about us every day. I like this slide because it kind of gives you a visual idea of the amount of records. The big square is the number of Facebook records there are. There were about 140 billion photos held by Facebook when this was made, and that was last year, so it's considerably more than that now. The little circle outside, the little corner there, the big square is Flickr. That's the number of Flickr photos there are. The smaller square is Instagram, though that's probably grown given their acquisition by Facebook. But that tiny little dot in the corner, that's the Library of Congress. So that's how many records were being held pre-digital age in a way that you might consider to be held for a long period of time. So that's just one of the many records that's grown so dramatically. So, to my mind, this many records really, of course, argues for more protections, not less. I mean, we've got records, of things that we never even conceived of. So we really need more protections. How did we get here is sort of a question that we'll cover throughout, but I think it's useful to think about how computers and record keeping has changed in the last 20 years. Computers have gotten smaller, faster, the processing power has increased, the storage has gotten much cheaper, we've got, so much more ability to store and save things. It's actually gotten to the point now where large companies, by and large, unless they're mandated to under law or for some other regime, are getting close to the point where it's not worth it to them to delete things. Like when they're done with the records, they'll throw away the servers. That's cheaper than going and deleting the records, and that's how cheap the server capacity is. So that, that just argues for how many records are going to be kept. So while this has all been happening, of course, the law has changed dramatically and, in lightning quickness to keep pace. Yeah, no, not at all, unfortunately. We have really seen what I would characterize as it's really just the typical pace of law, honestly. I'll give you one example. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is the law that governs email and other digital records, has not been updated since Top Gun was in the movie theaters, 1986. So of course, the internet is completely the same as it was in 1986, and there's been no, you can imagine the technology just doesn't map the way, the law just doesn't map to the way the technology is used now, and that leaves huge gaps. And at the same time that the statutory protections haven't kept up, we've got some legal doctrines like, for example, the most prominent of which is the third-party doctrine. And I don't know if you guys have come across the third-party doctrine yet. I actually honestly don't remember it from law school. It wasn't something that we taught. But the third-party doctrine essentially says that if you share records and information with a third party, you must have meant to give up your Fourth Amendment privacy interest in it. And it comes from a line of bank secrecy and phone records cases from the 70s where the court said, well, of course, if you're sharing your records with the bank, you must not really want your Fourth Amendment protections. Well, I mean, that had significant implications for financial privacy and telecom privacy even then. But imagine what it means now. I mean, all our records are held by third parties, whether it's a doctor, whether it's your internet provider. So the idea that they've all been pulled outside of the protection of the Fourth Amendment is really it's a dramatic change, and it really just sort of happened by accident. So this has created a series of issues that aren't there isn't one privacy problem to solve here. There's a series of interconnected problems. And we've already talked about how email doesn't map. or how we've already talked about how the electronic communications don't have privacy. So I'm going to give you another example of that. This chart is essentially the level of protection that an email receives at the different parts of its life cycle. So, and keep in mind, the email did exist in 1986. This wasn't a technology that Congress hadn't heard of, but what it was a technology that they didn't really understand. In 1986, they weren't sure whether email was more like a letter that someone sent or more like a telephone call. So the way they treated it was as sort of being ephemeral. In 1986, if you got an email, you downloaded it from the company server and you put it on your computer. That's how email worked. And if it stayed on the computer server for more than 180 days, they assumed, well, it's basically discarded information. You're not interested in the record. So email receives less protection after 180 days if it's on a company's computer. Well, all email now is essentially held by either Google or Yahoo, or, I mean, there are people who still download it onto their computers, but by and large they don't. So if you look at this, when you're drafting it on your computer, on Yahoo, you can get it essentially with a court order that requires basically just relevance. While it's in transmission, it's treated like a phone call, which requires a super warrant, so more than a warrant. When it hits your inbox and it isn't opened, it requires a warrant. Depending on who you ask, the Department of Justice would say, actually, once you open it, it goes down here. Some courts have said, no, you continue to get warrant protection for the first 180 days. After 180 days, though, it drops down to relevance. So you can sort of see, like, this is not a sensible legal regime, but it's, it's what we have after 1986. Similarly, records are not, they weren't contemplated for how much information could be shared by a record. This is a map of a tweet. This is not, I know you can't read it all, but the little pink at the very top, that's the actual tweet. All the rest of this stuff is just information that you don't see that's carried along with the tweet, like your location and your biography, the URL that you sent it from, or the URL that's packaged in it, where you sent it from. All of this comes with every tweet, and in many ways it's much more interesting to, for example, law enforcement than what you actually said in your Twitter feed. So, and of course the government is interested in this. Google has done a fantastic job. They're one of the few companies that actually reports how many requests they get from the government, and they can only report on a subset for their national security reasons why some of the requests don't get reported on. But they got about 5,900 requests in the last 6 months. So they're constantly getting requests for information on Gmail accounts, on search history. It's a constant area of interest. So that's the sort of content and the stuff we send. Now, we also, of course, spend a lot of time moving about online. And one of the things that has arisen from our movements and our web surfing habits is a new advertising model. And that advertising model is called behavioral targeting. And essentially the idea of behavioral targeting is that I am going to track you, I being a third-party advertiser, the ads that you see on the side of New York Times and ESPN are not owned by ESPN. Those are third-party advertising deliverers. And they're the same ones whether you're on ESPN or New York Times or many other sites. And so they're essentially tracking you as you move around the web so they can show you more targeted advertising. And at the same time, they're building a detailed profile of what you're interested in. This is a great email program called Collusion that essentially shows who else is interested in you. This is a map of my visiting 3 sites: Forbes, New York Times, and Wired. So you can see when I go to Wired how many other entities are getting information about my web surfing habits. Here's a few more. Here's a month or so. How much information is flowing out, not just to first parties where I visit, but third parties as well that I may not be aware of. And my personal favorite, see all that information flowing into that one in the center? That's ComScore. ComScore is Google's advertising, or excuse me, that's DoubleClick. DoubleClick is Google's advertising arm. So in addition to all the other information, and I'm not picking on Google, lots of people collect a lot of information, but in addition to what's collected by Google, you see all this other information that's coming into them from sites that you visit that you really have no idea are related to Google. And so what we've done here, beyond beyond sort of advertising, is we've created an incentive for tracking. Right? There's now an economic interest that these companies have in tracking us so they can deliver targeted advertising. Well, that's a troubling trend because, Big Brother may have a hard time building a real surveillance society, but modern capitalism is really good at, if you create an economic incentive for something, they're really good at fulfilling that economic incentive. So if we have an economic incentive for tracking, we're likely to see a more and more powerful tracking system. So this is, we don't have direct evidence that this kind of information is shared with the government on a routine basis, but I think it's very interesting. I won't read you all this. I'll just note that this is two different slides. This is from two different pages on Axiom's website. Axiom is a data broker. They're an entity that's business model is essentially selling information on each of us. And they do that, they sell it to the government, and they also sell it to advertisers. So on one page, they're touting how they can take the information that they collect online and combine it with offline information and build a detailed profile of users. And they call it anonymous online world, but it's not anonymous, so we can talk about that. But then on another page, they're providing investigative tools for government agencies, law enforcement, and security. So, I mean, it's hard to see how these back-end databases can't be connected. Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. It's very confirming to me because of the compromise that PayPal did. It was either with the national security people because of closing down, I can't remember who it was. I think it was WikiLeaks. It was a WikiLeaks issue. And they cut off their PayPal. And it was a government-instigated thing.
Yeah, and we can talk about it. I mean, there have been WikiLeaks is sort of I don't want to take us too far down that path, but yeah, there's definitely pressure that can be exerted on, for example, payment agencies to prevent practices that they don't like.
Well, no, what I'm trying to say is if they're willing to bow to pressure on something as amorphous as we think WikiLeaks is a bad guy, then if they truly have leverage to get information from commercial establishments, then it's easier.
Well, and it's true, but to be honest, it's not actually necessary to bow to any pressure. Axiom and other companies are willingly selling this information. They have contracts with the government. This is for sale. So it's not even like they don't have to twist any arms. This is you can go to the website and get it. You see the FBI has a contract with Axiom. So we know that this information exchange is going on. And then we move to everybody's favorite, social networking, where we're sharing all kinds of information. I don't know if you can read the bottom, but it says, if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product being sold. And that's really, Facebook is in the business of selling their knowledge about you to advertisers. That's how they make their money. So there is an enormous amount of collection going on. We know that other entities are interested in what's happening on social networks. Believe it or not, the CIA has an investment arm. It's called In-Q-Tel, that invests in companies that they think have useful technology. And one of the companies they invested in, oh, I missed a slide, but I'll go, there we go. There's the CIA. I'll go back to the other guy in a second. And so the CIA has invested in a company that's monitoring overseas social networking accounts. It's not necessarily domestic, but it's the same technology, and honestly, in most cases, it's the same companies. So And this does have an effect on people, and people really are harmed by the monitoring of social networking sites. This is where I'll go back to Kurt Nordland. Kurt actually had his, sorry, I keep doing that. Kurt actually had his insurance company cancel his workers' comp based on pictures that appeared in his Facebook page, one of them being this one, that showed that if he could be on a beach in Cancun, his shoulder really must not be bothering him, and hence he didn't need shoulder surgery and didn't need workers' comp. And he fought that in court and eventually won, but he had to pay a lawyer, and he actually had to go in and confront this insurance company and this claim that that in fact didn't deserve workers' comp. So even if you're not, even if you think you have nothing to hide, that doesn't mean information can't be used against you. There were 322 million mobile devices in the US as of earlier this year. I'm sure there are more now. Yes, there are more devices than there are people. People have two. And apparently more, more than that, since I assume all the kids don't necessarily have them at this point. But, a cell phone is in essence a portable tracking device. Right? It's monitoring your movements and sending your location about every 7 seconds to a cell phone tower. So that's a detailed pattern of, as one court said, whether you're a weekly churchgoer, a heavy drinker, a regular at the gym, an unfaithful husband, an outpatient receiving medical treatment, an associate of a particular individual or political groups, and not just one such fact about a person, but all such facts. This is a great slide that I won't talk about too much, but this information goes to an awful lot of places. It's saved on your phone in a variety of ways. It's saved by the devices or by the apps on your phone. It's saved by providers that provide your location, like Google and Apple and Skyhook. It's saved by the carrier itself. It's saved by third parties that, like maybe Pandora, for example, that may be an app on your phone. So your location information is promiscuously available.
To refer back to that picture again of the guy at Cancun, is it possible for those information, for those data miners to find a picture of a person if there's not like a caption with your name under it? It's
harder. There's what we're seeing the rise of is now, especially on social networks, is face recognition, where they're able to actually recognize the individuals and a picture. And the reason for that is that the hardest thing about face recognition, and the reason it's difficult to do, is because face recognition has existed as a technology for a long time, but it's hard to compare, like do one-to-many matches. If you've got like one picture and a million potential matches for it, it's hard to sort of figure out who's in that picture, right? It's just a lot of processing power. But if you've only got to compare it to the people who's friends, right? You've got a discrete subset of people, well, then you've got a much narrower category, and it's easier for them to identify people in pictures. So it's actually something that's happening more and more frequently. It's still not like every photo you see can be identified by face recognition, but it's becoming more common. I won't talk, it's been a lot in the news, and we can talk about it in Q&A if you want. This is one of our cybersecurity sort of things. But cybersecurity is not so much, doesn't fit neatly in some of these categories because it's not really a technology, it's more of a fear, if you will. Essentially, the government is using people's concern about oftentimes legitimate things like denial of service attacks, but turning them into less well-documented things like the terrorists are going to knock out the power grid. So I mention it just because I know sometimes people have questions about it, and I'm happy to talk about it at the end. But at this point, what we're seeing with cybersecurity is more of an effort to cash in on people's fears rather than much of the rest of this stuff, which is legitimate technological change that just sort of creates privacy problems as a byproduct. So why does this matter? Why do we care? For some people, this is sort of like a nonsensical question. They're like, well, of course I care. This is freaking crazy. Pardon my French. This is my favorite, Julian Assange. You know how the government always tells you if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear? I'm just letting them prove it. Sorry, I thought that was funny. Well, you know, of course, we all do have things we want to hide. I mean, you know, we may just want to keep our salary to ourselves or our love life. I mean, just sometimes you just want to have a private space to be silly or, you know, hide the fact that you really are a huge Justin Bieber fan and you just don't want the world to know that. I mean, so you just want privacy. But, you know, this information can also be misused. One reporter asked a company to search out information on her online, and she disclosed that armed only with her name and email address, within 30 minutes, the company had her social security number. In 2 hours, they knew where she lived, her body type, her hometown, her health status. And the best part about that, I thought, was that they actually told her, well, we could have gotten it to you in less than 2 hours. We just got busy doing something else. So, you know, this kind of information is, you know, you can leave you vulnerable to real dangers like data, you know, identity theft and misuse. It also puts us in danger. It also puts particular populations in danger. For example, this is Richard Guthrie. He's a 92-year-old war veteran. He was bilked out of more than $100,000 by criminals who identified him from marketing lists. Info USA, and I don't think they still do this, but they did for a long time, routinely advertised lists of suffering seniors, 4.7 million people with cancer or Alzheimer's. Imagine if you know that about somebody and the way that you can misuse that information, and that's freely accessible for sale. The variety of information that's known about us can also create power imbalances. You know, Target knows so much about people that they actually knew a girl was pregnant before her parents did. And they were, you know, the dad went in furious to his local Target because his daughter was suddenly getting like, you know, advertisements for baby carriages. And then, you know, he had to sheepishly return to the store like a week later and say, well, actually, and they know that because they know the things that people buy when they suddenly become pregnant, like, and it's not, you know, it's like body lotion. And there's just like, they have a list of things that they can tell you. And, you know, and while that's creepy, personally, I think what's more disturbing is Target actually makes decisions about, for example, what coupons to send you based on their knowledge of how much money you make. So if they know that you make $100,000, they'll send you a $10 coupon because they know the $1 coupon won't get you in the store. But if you make $20,000 a year and you're sort of at the top of your spending capacity, you only get that $1 coupon. And that's a real difference. I mean, that's something you're facing essentially an economic discrimination based on a power imbalance about what a company knows about you that you're really not aware of. You know, people routinely lose their jobs because of mistakes in background checks. And, you know, oftentimes what'll happen is there'll be a background check and it'll be bad information and people won't get a job, but then they'll either never find out about it because they just won't receive the job at all, or they'll say, for example, be bounced from a job and then a mistake will later be corrected, but the employer doesn't go back and give you your job back necessarily, and they're not obliged to do so. And, you know, we also, more fundamentally, certainly from an ACLU point of view, you know, many of the civil liberties benefits of the internet, the ability to read provocative materials, associate with non-mainstream groups, voice dissenting opinions, all of that come from having anonymity online, you know, or at least a level of anonymity. You know, it was recently revealed by Rolling Stone that DHS wrote a report on Occupy Wall Street, noting that, and they culled much of the information from that report from the internet. And actually, the report in some ways was relatively, relatively, I wouldn't call it benign. The idea of government keeping reports on lawful protest is never benign, but it was inoffensive, but it did contain this gem. Large-scale demonstrations also carry the potential for violence, presenting a significant challenge to law enforcement. Gives a pretty disturbing spin on what I think most of us would agree is a lawful, non-violent group of protesters. So, assuming I've convinced you that there is some problem here and there's an issue that we might want to do something about, what do we do? You know, and I think that the thing to understand here, especially for a group of lawyers or soon-to-be lawyers, is that these problems are not immutable privacy problems. They're problems of law that can be addressed by law. For example, why don't these have these? I mean, there are video cameras everywhere. Why don't they have microphones on them? And it's basically because there was a Supreme Court case in the 60s called Katz that said you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your phone, in your conversations. It was your phone conversations, but it was also private conversations. And so, you know, videotaping someone in public didn't violate that expectation, but listening and recording their phone calls did. So technology changed, it adapted to the fact that you weren't allowed to record somebody. And so there's a lot of change that needs to happen here. And you know, some of it's relatively straightforward. I mean, we need to update our federal statutes. Our statute protecting email should not have been updated last in 1986. And there are bills in Congress to update them. For example, the ECBA Reform Act, which is a snazzy title, I did not give it that title, would, for example, update update content protection. So the content of an email, a private social networking post, or what texts would all be covered by a full warrant protection at all times. And you know, the GPS Act the GPS Act, which is both a House and a Senate bill, would say that your location information, accessing information about, you know, where your cell phone is, essentially, and by implication you, would also require a warrant at all times. And these are, both of these statutes are unfortunately not getting the kind of, these are both statutes I lobby on in Congress, and they're tough to get passed, not just because people don't necessarily want to do it, though certainly law enforcement never wants to give up an advantage that they've accrued, and they even if it seems like a law is out of date frequently, they don't want to update it. But you also have a sort of an unfortunate dynamic that'll happen in Congress, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A sometimes, where there's this idea that everything is a trade-off. So, well, if you want to update email privacy, what are you going to give law enforcement? You know, what are they going to get in exchange? Well, we just think the law's out of date, they should update it. It shouldn't be, but there's that dynamic, and so you've got to sort of work within the constraints that you have, but sometimes you don't want it, you're not willing to do that. So we're of course not limited to Congress. We also have I'm not ready for that one yet. We also have the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, after I would say a relatively disappointing stretch in protecting the Fourth Amendment, I think incredibly disappointing, recently had a fantastic decision called in a case called U.S. v. Jones. And in that case, the court recently said, in just this term, that law enforcement needed, that the Fourth Amendment covered your location information. So if law enforcement wanted to put a GPS tracking device on the bottom of a car, that implicated the Fourth Amendment. They didn't actually say flat out that required a warrant. I think that will be hopefully the implication from the case as it gets sorted out in the lower courts. But they said for the first time, essentially, records, third-party records about you, which is to say your location information, are protected by the Fourth Amendment. So that's a huge change, and that's an important implication. We're also seeing state laws starting to push the protections for the GPS. So we're seeing laws in Oklahoma, Maryland, California, New Hampshire, which are all pushing to grant more protection for mobile information. So the states are another area. Scott and I were talking earlier, the Montana Constitution actually has an explicit protection for privacy. So there may be state litigation, once you guys pass the bar and you're Montana lawyers, there may be state litigation that you can push to get really a robust state constitutional protection in Montana for some of this. You can build on the, what the Jones decision says and try to get, protection for more different types of records, not just location records, but other records. We're also having, we also try to do push for protections in sort of less straightforward channels than just the courts and the state legislatures and Congress. We also try to push for companies to adopt meaningful protections on their own. And that can be kind of a mixed bag, candidly. I mean, typically companies don't do things that are not in their self-interest or in the interest of their stakeholders, or their shareholders, I guess I should say more accurately. But for example, companies are starting to feel and get the sort of sense that their customers don't like this idea of being tracked. They find it kind of creepy, and that there are times when that they want to use their services but maybe don't want to be tracked. So that, we have pushed companies to adopt what we would call a do not track mechanism, which is where you can signal, and all the browser manufacturers have actually adopted this now, where you can click a box on your browser that says, don't track me during particular circumstances, and then all those third-party trackers won't be recording your information. The problem is, for a browser manufacturer can send that signal out, but it requires all those other third parties to honor it. And right now, there isn't a legal requirement that they honor it. However, what we've been pushing on through pressure from the White House, through other sort of less formal means, is to essentially get them to commit to follow it. And if they do commit to follow it, then they're bound by that obligation. The Federal Trade Commission actually has authority to enforce what's called unfair and deceptive trade practices. So if you say you're going to do one thing and you don't then do it, that's actually enforceable under federal law. So it's sort of it's not a statute, but if we can get them to commit to an actual standard, then maybe we can get this do not track mechanism to be something that's real and meaningful. So that's sort of a different way of going about trying to get some of these same protections. So ultimately, of course, I can't predict the future. This is my, there was my privacy. I missed a couple of slides. I can't, I won't even try to explain why I had the goose that killed the golden egg in here, except to say that I think what I was going for here is that none of us want to harm the internet while we're doing this kind of regulation. But at this point, I think we're not really in a place where we're actually over-regulating the internet. I think we're actually in a place where we have very little protection for consumers online. But nonetheless, we don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. So ultimately, I can't predict the future. This is my favorite slide about predicting the future, because I think it sort of embodies the danger that happens when you're facing the wrong direction when the bulldozer comes. But I will say that I believe that fundamentally the principles embodied in the Fourth Amendment are part of the bedrock of this country. They're deeper than any technological change. We have to adapt to new technologies, but I don't think we have to compromise our fundamental right to privacy. We have to remember that the problems we have are the result, in many cases, of bad and outdated law. We can fix them, and we can still enjoy the benefits of these new technologies. Thank you. So, questions? Did I stun you all into submission? In the back?
So, you were on slide 2 and I was ready to throw my cell phone out. So do you have a Facebook page? Do you have a cell phone? I mean, do you?
Sure.
Talk to us about.
It's funny, you do make a lot of choices. I mean, part of what I do as a lobbyist is trying to do public communications and trying to sort of engage people, and a lot of that involves new technologies and new media. I mean, certainly lobbyists can't get by without some kind of cell phone. So I make a variety of choices. I have a Facebook page, but it is essentially just a static page. I wouldn't want to have no information up because I wouldn't actually want my online sort of profile to be hijacked, if you will. I like to make sure that people know there is a real Chris Calabrese, who I am, but provide a very limited amount of information. And I very rarely update it. Actually, when I check my Facebook page, I use a browser. I use Internet Explorer, which I never use for anything else. So essentially the third-party cookies that Facebook puts on my page, and just so everybody knows, you know the like buttons that are on all the other pages that aren't Facebook's pages? They report back to Facebook. When you're logged into your Facebook account, but you go other places, the like button is reporting back to Facebook all those other pages that you visited. So I sort of keep Facebook cabined off. I use a cell phone, and I think cell phones in many ways are the most confounding, but also the area where there's the most sort of potential positive development here. Because like I said, there really has been a good Supreme Court case, and there is a potential for an actual meaningful warrant requirement for location. And honestly, I can't do my job without a cell phone, so I have one. And then I like, for example, Twitter. I think Twitter is a nice technology. You're typically conveying the information that you want to convey. I mean, I showed you the map of the tweet, and there is a lot of information in a tweet that maybe you're not aware of, but you have much more control over what you're sharing with Twitter than you do with a lot of other sort of social networking apps. And there are things you can do. I mean, I didn't get into this, but for example, if you really don't want to be tracked online, if you use Internet Explorer, they have what's called a tracking protection list. If you go to safety there, you can engage a tracking protection list, and that's actually a list of all the third-party trackers, and you can essentially ask them to block those sites from tracking you. You can also use, if you use Mozilla, you can use something called ad block, which can block sites from actually putting third parties. So there are things you can do. I don't typically talk a lot about them because I feel like by and large it gives people a false sense of security, a sense that you actually can control this. I don't think we're at a place where self-help is enough, that you can really sort of control your online life simply by using a particular technology. But I do think that we shouldn't not get to use the technology. So that's kind of the way I see the battle shaping up. Another one?
Great presentation. I'm a first-year law student, and I was wondering if you could...
It gets better. Sorry. I said it gets better.
I was wondering if you could comment on Senate Bill 1813. It just passed in mid-March. I think it's the transportation reauthorization bill.
Oh, is this the black box bill?
Yeah, it's the black box on section 31406 about vehicle event data recorders, and I wanted to hear what you thought about that.
Well, to give a little background, a vehicle event recorder is what it's called a black box, is something that's been in many automobiles for a long time, and the bill would actually mandate it to go in all automobiles. And what it does is record essentially the movements of your automobile. And you sort of have to differentiate between different kinds of black boxes. The one that's typically required under federal regulation is essentially a recorder that typically just records a relatively limited amount of information, which is what happens before and after a crash, so that law enforcement will know like how fast you were going, how fast you sort of moved to the side, essentially what happened to the car. So what this bill does is mandate that all cars have black boxes. The problem is that there's nothing in the bill that says that that's all the information that can be recorded. So, in theory, you could record the car's movements for a much greater period of time and access that down the road. The reason that I don't actually think it's as big a deal as we've seen some sort of commentary on is that, first of all, I haven't seen evidence that that's happening. By and large, it seems like the black boxes are being used in a very limited fashion. And one of the protections that the bill does contain, which hasn't actually existed before in a lot of cases, is a legal statement that the owner of the car, or if you're leasing the car or that you're renting a car, the driver is actually the person that owns the data. So a court order would be required to get that information. So, I mean, I think that's a really important protection, especially when you consider that, you know, again, we're carrying around these portable tracking devices. So there's a lot of sort of easier ways to track someone than to essentially get the black box off their car or access that information. It's not that it isn't a privacy concern. I think that there are greater privacy concerns, and we haven't, and I think there really has been an effort to limit that by giving users some control and ownership over the data.
Some of what the ACLU and civil liberties organizations do is sort of educate the rest of us about liberties that we have or losing or don't care about. And anyway, it seems to me that a common change that's happened recently is not so much in technology, but our response to it. A lot of people just sort of feel overwhelmed. I give up on it. Or I give up on notions of privacy, including some fairly deep things about, you know, what are social limits, etc. Is our Fourth Amendment protections worth reviving?
I hope so. Well, you know, it's funny. I mean, I hear that question a lot, and I think there's a couple of things going on there. One is I do think people are overwhelmed. I think they feel like there's so many, the privacy problems are coming at them from so many different directions. It is easy to just say, I can't deal with it. There is sort of a second idea, though, that I dispute, which is that people don't care about privacy, or they've sort of, you know, people point to like, well, look how much information is being posted on Facebook. Do they really care? You know, you really like, but I think that, in fact, people have just a different articulation of privacy now than maybe we did in the past, and that's more of an idea of information control versus secrecy. So it's like, it's not that I necessarily want to keep everything to myself, but I want to control who sees it and how it's used. So it's, you know, I don't want the insurance, I want to be able to share my photos from the Bahamas. I just don't want my insurance company to use it to discriminate against me. So, you know, there's a little bit of a sort of a difference there, I think. And there's also sort of an interesting lawyery kind of question that you guys might dig, but I think the sort of general audiences I talk to sometimes don't. And that's the fact that we have a Fourth Amendment that is essentially based on a reasonable expectation of privacy, right? And that's sort of a fundamental concept of what do we think is objectively reasonable and subjectively reasonable. Well, as we change, right, if as society changes, are we in fact sort of eroding the Fourth Amendment by our demonstrated expectation in less privacy? Or is in fact the fact that we really need to use a cell phone because everybody has a cell phone now, does that really mean that we don't think we should have privacy in our location information? It's just sort of, it's a tricky kind of Fourth Amendment expectation question, right? Because it's like, well, you know, it kind of depends on, and that's like one of those, well, it depends on what judge you get that day, right? It's like, is the judge going to think that's, well, of course everybody has a cell phone, that doesn't mean they don't want location privacy, or is that going to be the linchpin of the decision they write saying that nobody should get mobile privacy?
You know that situation with Google collecting the, you know, those on-street things. So as I understand it, the privacy issue was that they were also picking up communications data. But what if, I mean, does anybody think it's a problem that you can look at somebody's house from the street and see, like I was looking at my sister's house the other day and I said, God, I didn't know she could afford a truck that big. I mean, is that kind of thing an issue for anyone?
Well, you know, or is your planning department looking and saying, oh, that's interesting, they didn't get a permit for that pool they have in the backyard, which they do a lot now. You know, the Google, the Y-Spy scandal, as it's called, I don't know if it's called anywhere else, as it's called in DC, was essentially the Google Street View cameras, right? When they go around and take photos of it, the streets, they're also collecting the location of Wi-Fi hotspots and Wi-Fi, you know, outlets, whether or not they're encoded or not. And they do that for a very specific reason. They use that for location tracking. So if your phone picks up a Wi-Fi hotspot, they may use that to locate you instead of a cell tower or instead of your GPS because it's faster. So that's why they're pulling that information in. And where they got into trouble was they were also, in cases where the person hadn't secured their Wi-Fi hotspot, they were essentially also collecting tidbits of whatever was going across their hotspot at that particular time. So sometimes it was email, sometimes it was passwords. They were actually collecting content information. And I mean, the FCC recently decided that, yeah, that there wasn't a privacy issue there or it wasn't a violation because essentially people were broadcasting in the clear, and they were sharing that information publicly. Now, there's a lot of people that disagree with that think that information should be covered. Candidly, in this case, I mean, I have a hard time seeing how this violates the Wiretap Act. And that was really what some people, just because, again, you're broadcasting in the clear. But I think it does sort of demonstrate why we need, what we don't have in this country that almost every other industrialized nation in the world has, is a comprehensive privacy law. If you go to Europe, if you go to Australia, if you go to Canada, there is an overarching law that protects your personal information, independent of the technology or the medium or whether it's your medical records or financial. And we don't have that in the United States. We have sector-specific laws, but when you have a new circumstance like this that arises, it's not going to be protected because, again, we don't have the overall law to protect it. Why? Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's interesting because the principles that underlie that are actually originated in the United States. They're called the Fair Information Practice Principles, and they were first created by the Department of, I forget what it was called, I think it was then Health and Human Services, or just maybe the Department of Health. But they essentially promulgated the rules to help control medical records in the early 70s. And then they were ultimately promulgated in Europe and became laws, and it never happened in the United States, though they do happen for, like I said, specific sectors. And it's interesting. You ask a European this question, and they'll say, the Europeans have what I think to the United States or people in the United States is sort of a surprising degree of trust in the government and suspicion about corporations. And we sort of have a surprising degree of trust in corporations and suspicion about the government. And I'll leave you to decide which is better or worse, but I think that's part of the reason that it's you can't trust the companies with your information. But they'll have, in many cases, surveillance laws that we find very surprising.
I'm not a lawyer, but I would love it if we had a discussion like this every week here. This would be great. I have been under the assumption that the ACLU was a promoter of civil liberties. So when you come here to talk in a way of lobbying us to your argument, it is surprising to me. And to answer the question why, I actually think that we do have that law, and that is the Fourth Amendment. And the interpretation of that law, and I know there's the constitutional people and the others, and I don't remember which one here it goes with, but if you take each situation as it comes to you, if you're a judge or what have you, then there isn't a need to make laws, and therefore that's where I think the Civil Liberties Union and the movement is in the right place, and making laws that are specific to certain kinds of privacy are going the wrong way, because inevitably I have seen in my lifetime, especially within the past 10 years since 9/11, that if you make a law, the powers that be, or the corporate who will find the loopholes and the ways around it, such that the individual now is powerless.
Well, There's a lot there. I think first, part of the sort of bedrock principle of the Fourth Amendment is that it only applies to the government. It doesn't apply to companies. So there really is a question about whether there should be rules that apply to corporate conduct, and that's sort of a separate question. And it's fair to say judges should address things as they come up, but if there's no law for the judge to address, the judge's hands are tied, and there are interesting questions, and it's actually a very libertarian sort of, I don't know, but that's a philosophy but it's a very sort of small L libertarian idea that common law, this idea that we have common law rights and common law rights to privacy, and that we really should essentially be able to take our privacy harms to court and get our privacy rights, ratified in that way, and sue the people who do that. There is certainly a fundamental idea that there's value to that. I will say that I think one of the issues is in privacy law, certainly it can be hard to quantify the harms. It can be, the fact that you may not want to be surveilled may not be viewed by the court as a harm per se. And so that's a difficult issue. In many cases, it can be difficult to know what's happened, and how you've been harmed. And then ultimately, what happens with the government, it can be outside of the ambit. If it's not a concrete protection that, for example, is embodied in the Fourth Amendment, and if the Fourth Amendment has been interpreted in such a way as to not cover that situation, there's really no way for you to go to that law enforcement agency and really get your rights, especially if you're a criminal defendant, get your rights protected. Maybe I think we're just about at time, maybe one more?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Your last one. And this is off topic, so I was just curious about the drones and where that's going to fit into the privacy thing.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Did you hear about the busload of people that got arrested on the way to protest drones? 11 cop cars stopped and arrested a busload of protesters before they got to the Air Force Base to protest, and I'm sure they were tracked.
Wow. That doesn't surprise me. I hadn't heard the story, but it doesn't surprise me. So give me a chance to push some ACLU resources, so thank you for that. There is an entire ACLU site. It's aclu.org/spyfiles, all one word, which is just story after story of law enforcement stifling protest. And if protesters being arrested, and so if you want to just sort of, the patterns are almost endless, and there's a whole talk I could give on that. But if you're interested in the subject, that's that. We also just wrote, I think I could say, a very good report on drones. I can say that because I didn't write the report, but it's a really good look at how drones work, what the different types of them are, and what we think the protection should be. Drones are a fairly new technology. Right now, there is very limited protection for what you can do with drones. So, but if you Google ACLU drone report, we published it in the last couple of months. It's gotten great press, and it's pretty easy to find. And I will also push a few other resources since I have a captive audience. ACLU.org/blog. Free Future is the ACLU. We just launched it this week, but is the ACLU's blog that is aimed directly at these types of issues, technology and technological issues, and how they're affecting our civil liberties. It's really, I think, going to be an exciting place for us to kind of have an intellectual discussion, not just update people on what's going on, but also sort of have an intellectual discussion about what do these new technologies mean. And then .rights.org is our site that talks about how, just kind of lays out with some nice graphics and some relatively straightforward fact sheets, things like email privacy and mobile privacy, and so you can sort of have the state of the law. You can know where the various bills are. So if you want to stay plugged in, .rights is a great place to do it. So thank you very much. Thanks so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.